In the last days of the war, Hitler's once mighty regime lay in shambles. At one time, the German Führer and his armies controlled nearly the entire landmass of Europe. By the end of April 1945, he could barely hold his own capital city. The American and British armies closed in from the west. The Soviet Red Army attacked from the east. Together, the Allies had virtually destroyed the German war fighting machine. In his final days, Hitler signed an order and named the new president of the Reich. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz would be the second Führer and inherit command of what remained of the German forces. No one questioned Admiral Dönitz's loyalty and dedication to the Nazi cause. During the war, as commander of the U-boat fleet, he faithfully carried out Hitler's orders. But now, as the new Führer, he could not ignore the disastrous reports coming from the battlefronts. German soldiers were walking into prisoner of war camps by the tens of thousands. Dönitz had decided to end the war as quickly as possible, but he wanted to delay the general surrender of all forces in order to, as he put it, save the maximum number of Germans from Bolshevism and enslavement. The admiral wanted to buy more time for German civilians and soldiers who were trying to avoid capture by the Russians and struggling to reach the jurisdiction of American and British troops. But the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, refused any deals. The Allies had agreed among themselves that the German surrender must be unconditional. The Allies would not accept any conditions or consider any special options requested by Admiral Dönitz and the German commanders. The Germans would have to carry out, without exception, the orders of their Allied captors.
The Allies, Russian and Western Allies, were in total agreement about what they were going to do. There was no division between them over the terms of the surrender. Unconditional surrender, no separate terms, no deals, nothing. Just lay down your arms and that is it.
Dönitz was running out of time. The rapid advance of Allied armies had isolated large parts of the German force in Italy. On Sunday afternoon, April 29th, two German officers, looking rather incongruous in civilian clothing, sat down at the headquarters of the British Army near Naples and signed the first formal surrender of German forces. Their signatures handed over to the British nearly 1 million men. 3 days later, on May 2nd, the ranking German left alive in Berlin emerged from his bunker with a white flag and surrendered the capital and its garrison to the Soviet Red Army. From his headquarters in northern Germany, Admiral Dönitz realized he couldn't play for time any longer. He sent a representative, Admiral von Friedeberg, across the front lines into the British sector to meet with General Bernard Montgomery. Dönitz instructed von Friedeberg to surrender all of the German forces fighting in northern Germany, even those fighting the Russians to the east. But Montgomery rejected that offer. The British Field Marshal would accept only the surrender of enemy forces directly facing his front line. Montgomery told von Friedeberg to return to Dönitz and relay this message. The next evening, May 4th, von Friedeberg and his delegation returned to Montgomery's headquarters. They agreed to surrender only the German forces in Denmark, Holland, and northern Germany.
So we've assembled here today to accept the surrender terms which have been made with a delegation from the German army. I will now read out the terms of that instrument of surrender.
The document explained that the German surrender was accepted without conditions. The Germans would have to comply with all orders issued by the Allied commanders.
And the German delegation will now sign this paper. General Admiral von Friedeberg will sign first. Now, Kinsall will sign next.
On May 6th, Admiral Dönitz sent his army commander, General Jodl, and Admiral von Friedeberg to Eisenhower's headquarters in northern France to negotiate the surrender of all the German forces.
The German delegation arrived, expecting to be treated as professionals, to meet Eisenhower, possibly have coffee, certainly handshakes, and then discuss surrender terms. They were met by Eisenhower's chief of staff, who told them politely but firmly, there are no terms. You will surrender unconditionally, period. The German delegation went back, told Dönitz. He realized he had no choice. They went back, surrender documents were placed in front of them, and they were told to sign.
At the end of the ceremony, Jodl praised the suffering of the German people and armed forces and expressed hope that the victors will treat them with generosity.
After they signed, Eisenhower did meet with them. There were no handshakes. Eisenhower asked them bluntly, do you understand the terms of this surrender? Once they said, yes, we do, he turned around and left. It had been a cruel, a horrible, a terrible war. And Eisenhower, to his credit, in my opinion, was not about to treat them as gentlemen.
Eisenhower went out to the map room to meet with his staff, and they said, we've got to write a communique. And everybody had a try at writing out an appropriately eloquent last wartime message. And as they grew more and more eloquent, Eisenhower was growing more and more impatient with them, and finally he threw them all aside and pulled out a piece of paper and scribbled by hand, the mission of this Allied force was completed in 0245 hours, May 7, 1945, signed Eisenhower. And the war was over. They called for champagne. You had to have a celebration. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Everybody was just really exhausted. They brought out a bottle of champagne and popped it, and it was flat. And everybody just went to bed. But the war was over.
From New York City's Times Square to London's Piccadilly Circus to Moscow's Red Square, the victorious Allies celebrated the end of the war in Europe. But the surrender would not go into effect officially until May 8th. President Harry Truman declared May 8th as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day.
I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
The lights went on again. And all the great cities of Europe that had been blacked out since September of 1939, on May 8th, 1945, the lights were on. It was the occasion for the greatest outburst of joy in the history of mankind. There's never been anything like it. The end of that god-awful war had finally come.
World War II was both a war and a crime. Millions of innocent people were killed, and millions more lost their homes and property. The victims cried out for justice. Those who brought this suffering must be made to answer for their crimes.
After World War I, the Allies had decided in the peace treaty that people accused of war crimes should be tried. And one of the many concessions made to the Germans after the First World War was a change which the Allies had agreed to in the Versailles Treaty, that the Germans would try these criminals themselves. Well, that proved an absolute and total fiasco. And the Allies were not about to try that a second time.
Near the end of the war, the Allies organized a War Crimes Commission and set up a system for bringing criminals to justice. The commission decided that individuals who committed atrocities against persons or property would return for trial near the scene of their crime. Individuals accused of specific crimes, like killing prisoners of war or downed airmen, would be brought before military courts. An international tribunal would try the major war criminals, Hitler and the men of his inner circle. But Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and other high-ranking Nazis committed suicide before they could be arrested. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was captured alive and held to await trial.
They were going to ask him to open his mouth for a medical examination, but when they did so, he bit the cyanide capsule that he'd got hidden in his back teeth and died in front of them. So he escaped justice.
One by one, the Allies found and arrested the military commanders of the Reich, the men who ran the Nazi war machine. Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, surprisingly turned himself in to the U.S. Army. His captors received him more like a visiting dignitary than a prisoner of war.
When the press learned that Goering had fallen into American hands, of course they wanted an interview. So the Army produced Goering for a press conference, and Goering came out of the house in which he had been staying and sat under the trees in the garden and was thoroughly enjoying his press conference with the Americans, the give and take. And one of the questions was, do you realize that your name is on the list of war criminals to be tried? And this shook Goering. And he replied, no, I didn't know that, and I can't imagine why. But from this point on, he was not enjoying the press conference. There was nothing in his treatment at this point which gave him any idea that he was going to be looked on as a war criminal. He was allowed to wear his uniform, his medals, and I think that he thought that everything was going fine.
Goering's celebrity treatment ended abruptly when the Army moved him to a prisoner interrogation center.
It was there that he was stripped of his medals, and a ceremonial dagger that he wore was taken away from him, and his insignia was removed. And I think it was at this time he realized that all was not well.
In August 1945, after 3 months in custody, the Army moved Goering to a cell at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. The selection of Nuremberg was only fitting. During the 1930s, the city's destiny marched closely in step with that of Germany's Führer and the Nazi Party. But the practical, rather than the propaganda reasons, brought the accused to Nuremberg. The Palace of Justice was the only large courthouse that had survived the Allied bombing raids. By the end of September, 22 Nazi leaders, men who once controlled the fate of Europe, sat in Nuremberg's tiny cells.
This was the time that he was thoroughly searched. He was forced to strip. His comment at this time during this humiliation was only, I'm too fat. But he was forced to submit to a complete physical inspection, including a rectal examination, which must have been extremely humiliating for him. When he left the examination cell, he had nothing, not anything of his own that he came in with. Everything was left behind. And then he was moved into a cell which had been thoroughly searched, thoroughly combed for any means of self-destruction. Even nails were taken out of the walls.
A chair and a flimsy table built to collapse if an inmate stood on it to hang himself were the only pieces of furniture in the small cell. The prisoner's bunk was permanently bolted to the wall. During the night, the prisoners had to sleep with their hands exposed. They were forbidden from sleeping with their hands under the blankets. Guards posted outside the door kept an eye on the prisoners day and night. Even with these precautions, one determined defendant, Dr. Robert Lai, managed to find a way to kill himself.
One guard was responsible for 2 cells, and they were on duty at 2-hour shifts. When you're on duty for 2 hours and you're looking into a cell, time has a way of hanging heavy. And Dr. Lai, sitting on the toilet, managed to take a zipper from his GI jacket and evidently looped it around the pipe that ran down into the toilet. He stuffed rags in his mouth to keep himself from crying out, and leaning forward on the loop, he managed to hang himself. He managed to strangle himself.
The guard shifts were changed to one man watching one cell for 1 hour. The Army declared the prison suicide-proof. In the next month, the accused selected their lawyers and prepared their defense. On November 20th, 1945, 21 defendants entered the courtroom and saw for the first time the men who would judge them. On a raised dais opposite the prisoners sat 8 judges, 2 each from Great Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, with the British judge, Lord Geoffrey Lawrence, presiding. After the opening comments, the prosecutors read the indictments. It took the entire morning to outline the 4 charges.
On 30 August
1. A common conspiracy to seize power and establish a totalitarian regime in Germany.
the right to act
2. Initiating and waging a war of aggression. 3. War crimes in countries occupied by German armed forces and on the high seas. And 4. Crimes against humanity, enslavement and extermination based on racial and religious grounds. The judges called forward the defendants and asked for a plea of guilty or not guilty. Hermann Göring was the first to take the microphone.
Bevor ich die Frage des Gerichtshofes beantworte,
before I answer the question of whether I am guilty or not guilty,
I informed the court that defendants were not entitled to make a statement. You must plead guilty or not guilty.
bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage
I am
nicht
not
schuldig.
guilty.
Rudolf Hess. That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
Each of the 21 defendants stepped forward and asserted their innocence.
Ich bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage für nicht schuldig. Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig. Was ich getan habe oder tun musste.
What I did with a clean conscience before God, history, and the people of Germany.
Each of the 4 Allied countries had its own prosecutor in Nuremberg. Justice Robert Jackson was the chief prosecutor for the American delegation.
Robert Jackson was a justice on the United States Supreme Court. He was chosen by Truman to head up what came to be officially called the Office of the Chief of Prosecution of Axis Criminality. And he was first the chief American negotiator in the establishment of the Nuremberg court system. He was then the American chief prosecutor in the actual trial.
On the second day of the trial, Jackson stood before the court and delivered the opening statement on behalf of the international team of prosecutors.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history
for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated.
To convince the tribunal of the guilt of the men sitting in the prisoner's dock, Jackson and his team depended on three kinds of evidence.
Of all individuals kam zu dem Prozess vor dem Bayerischen Volksgericht für den 9. November.
Overwhelmingly, they depended upon German documents which had been captured. If you will, the papers of the people who were being prosecuted. That is to say, when they ordered prisoners of war to be killed, or people to be mistreated, or other terrible things to be done, the prosecution would present the documents signed by the individuals involved. In addition, they produced a small number of witnesses. For example, the man who had commanded the big killing center in Auschwitz was a witness in the trial.
The third and the most damaging form of evidence was the photographic record of Nazi atrocities.
The Allies had captured both pictures which the Germans had taken and movies which Germans had made, some of which were official movies and others had been made, if you will, unofficially by Germans, of mass killings, of all kinds of other terrible things. And then the Allies also introduced, as a part of this, pictures which they themselves had taken at the end of the war as death camps were overrun and so on.
With documents, witnesses, and films, Jackson outlined the criminal actions of the indicted men. Admiral Karl Dönitz, accused of crimes in the high seas. Baldur von Schirach, head of the Hitler Youth, for bending the minds of children to the Nazi cause. Julius Streicher, anti-Semitic newspaper publisher, who encouraged and organized the persecution of the Jews. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's confidant, held accountable for the conspiracy to seize power. Hitler's foreign minister von Ribbentrop, who signed and then broke treaties from Munich to Moscow. The Army's Chief of Staff, Wilhelm Keitel, and General Alfred Jodl for waging a war of aggression. And Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, whose Luftwaffe taught the world the meaning of total war. The charges brought to light the unimaginable nightmare that was the Third Reich.
Of course, the most sensational charges, the ones we all remember, and the most telling charges were those of crimes against humanity, because they had to do with the running of the concentration camps. And the staff of the International Military Tribunal had assembled what is still arresting and terrifying evidence of the nature of the concentration camps and the Nazi regime as a genocidal organization.
In the spring of 1946, after 4 months of prosecution testimony, the defendants finally took the stand. Their defense, more often than not, was, "I was only obeying orders." They blamed Hitler for everything. One after the other, they refuted the Führer whom they had revered for so long. The politicians blamed the soldiers, and the soldiers blamed the politicians, saying that they were only doing their duty. Hermann Goering took the stand in March and dominated the proceedings. He spoke uninterrupted for 9 days in a remarkable performance that Robert Jackson called a strange mix of wind and wisdom.
den Reichspräsidenten vorzuschlagen.
The others were either apathetic or ineffective, but Goering was just wonderful. Goering got laughs. Goering won points. And he was very conscious of what a good performance he was putting on. Goering, after all, had been a First World War fighter ace, and he had a tremendous personal presence.
For the rest of the summer, the accused were given the chance to defend their actions. 61 witnesses took the stand on their behalf. The defendants and their lawyers delivered their final statements on August 31st. After more than 200 days in court, the judges had heard enough and retired to make a decision. For a month, the accused waited in their cells for the judges to reach a verdict. On September 30th, 1946, they gathered for the last time inside the courtroom. The judges found 19 of the men guilty on at least one count of the indictment. A dozen of the men were sentenced to death by hanging. Rudolf Hess and 3 others received sentences of life in prison. Karl Dönitz received only 10 years in jail. 3 of the men were acquitted. Goering received a death sentence. He quickly filed a protest and requested that he be shot by a firing squad rather than be hanged. But the tribunal turned down his appeal.
The men who wore uniform, military uniform, felt that they were entitled to be executed in a military way. If they're going to execute us, at least treat us as men of military status and shoot us in our uniforms. They thought hanging a degradation, and I think there was that thought in the Allied mind. We're not going to distinguish between them. They're all going to be hanged. Hanging is an ignominious way. It's a criminal way of dying, and they are criminals, and we'll hang them as criminals.
Back in their cells, the condemned men wondered when the sentences would be carried out. Goering was well aware that the night of October 15th would be his last. He had been secretly informed by the German prison doctor that the executions would begin shortly after midnight. At about 8 p.m., watched closely by a guard in a cell that had been searched countless times in the past year, Goering changed into his silk pajamas and stretched out on his bunk.
Was watching him all the time. Goering started a restless motion with his hands. He moved them. His hands had to be kept above the blankets at all times. They were not allowed to put their hands at any time under the blanket. And he started moving his hands around, and the guard observed him moving his hand up across his face, and then he put his hands down to his side. And exactly at 10:44, the guard looked at him and saw that Goering had suddenly stiffened. And the guard thought that perhaps he'd had a heart attack. But it was at this moment Goering had bitten down on the glass vial that he had in his mouth, which contained hydrocyanic acid. And within a matter of very few minutes, he was dead. There was pandemonium in the prison after Goering had killed himself. American officers and Russian officers, British and French, were rushed to Goering's cell to find out what happened. And perhaps before it was ascertained that Goering was actually dead, the Russian general slapped Goering across the face. And when he was asked why he did this, he said that if Goering was faking, that certainly his eyes would move. So the Russians were very suspicious at this time that perhaps some sort of deal had been cut to allow Goering to escape the gallows. After Goering killed himself, there was frantic activity to get the others to the gallows. Von Ribbentrop was the first to be taken in. Probably the most dramatic execution was that of Streicher, the Gauleiter of Nuremberg and the editor of the anti-Semitic newspaper, Der Stürmer. First of all, he refused to get into his clothes in the cell when they came for him, and they had to forcibly dress him. Then they had to physically drag him from his cell to the execution chamber. And as he came in, he was screaming, "Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler."
As the army hangmen tightened the noose around Stryker's neck, Stryker spat at the hangman and declared, "Someday the Bolsheviks will hang you."
Perhaps because of the rush and so forth, it's reported that the executions did not go well, that rather than having their necks broken, the hangmen strangled to death very slowly at the end of the rope. Some reports say that it took as much as 20 minutes for some of these men to die.
The bodies of the 12 hanged men were taken to a crematorium and incinerated. The exact location of their scattered ashes will never be known. The press found out that Goering had cheated the hangman, and they demanded an explanation.
The army was put in an extremely precarious position after Goering killed himself. Now, first of all, they had allowed their chief prisoner to escape the gallows. Secondly, the Russians were claiming that the Americans had deliberately given Goering the poison in order to appease German nationalism at the time, in order to allow Goering to escape the gallows. They had to determine how Goering got the poison. So a three-man commission was appointed to study the circumstances of Goering's death. The commission concluded that Goering had always had the poison with him while in Nuremberg prison. They couldn't answer the question how he brought it into the prison, but the main conclusion was that Goering, subtle individual that he was, had outwitted the American army, and there was no complicity on the part of any U.S. soldier in the prison.
The army investigation was a whitewash. They did not answer exactly how Goering was able to hide the vial of poison, nearly 2 inches long, in his cell or on his body for almost an entire year.
I think that how Goering got the poison was that he had as a friend at Nuremberg an American officer. He had cultivated this American officer's friendship throughout the trial. They were both interested in hunting. They were both interested in guns. They were both extroverts. They were both very gregarious. And this American officer succumbed to Goering's charm. In fact, he often boasted about his friendship with Goering. And I believe that Goering probably cultivated this officer deliberately, because Goering brought with him into the prison the poison with which he killed himself. It was in Goering's baggage in the prison baggage room. Now, this was a room into which Goering had no access unless he was escorted by an American officer. I theorize that what happened is in the last days when Goering knew that he had to hang, he called on his American friend and told him, "Lieutenant, I know I have to die, but don't let me be hanged." It could have been that he asked the lieutenant to retrieve it for him, or it could have been more likely that he asked the lieutenant to take him into the baggage room and simply turn your back for a minute. And Goering retrieved the poison from the baggage room, from his luggage, took it back to the cell, and used it the next day.
One Army officer had both motive and opportunity to help Goering, Lieutenant Jack Tex Willis.
Willis had several items that obviously came from the baggage room. He had one of Goering's wristwatches. It was inscribed on the back with Goering's name. He had a solid gold fountain pen with Goering's name inscribed, several other valuable gifts. However, I don't think it could possibly be any bribery, because Willis, with the key to the baggage rooms, could have taken these things without Goering's permission, without Goering's knowledge. Goering must have known he was wearing the wristwatch, because he wore it there at the Nuremberg trials. He showed it to people. He openly displayed it. And to many people, he bragged about his friendship with Goering. I think that if Willis helped Goering, it was because he did not want to see his friend hang. It was not a matter of bribery.
Jack Willis never confessed to giving Goering the cyanide. Willis passed away in 1954 and took with him the answer to the mystery of Hermann Goering's suicide. Some have argued that because Goering had the power to decide his own fate, his suicide invalidated all of the work and the value of the lengthy trials. But the point of the Nuremberg trials was not just to bring the guilty to justice. The proceedings put down on paper a complete record for all the world to see of the horrors created by Hitler and his henchmen.